Hey guys, today we're going to be discussing David Hume's A Treatise on Human Nature. And this text is going to serve at once as the culmination of all the stuff we've been talking about, and also as a critique of a lot of the things we've been talking about. So, the whole class we've been really focused on these issues within metaphysics and epistemology concerning reality and knowledge. And a kind of subtopic within these guys that has been prevalent throughout the discussions we've been having is this question concerning the idea of self, right? What exactly is the self? What can we know about the self? How does the existence of self influence the existence of other things? How does it influence our perception of the world and all that good stuff? And we saw that in the first real text we read, Descartes' Meditations, the self played a pivotal role. Now, remember, Descartes' task was to figure out what he can know with absolute certainty, right? What is necessarily true. What is so true that it can't even be doubted in imagination, right? And Descartes landed on this idea that even when we can doubt literally everything else about reality and knowledge, the existence of matter, the existence of sensory information that we're getting, all that good stuff. What we can't doubt is, or what I can't doubt, right, because it's from the personal perspective, is the existence of myself as a thinking thing. It is solid, right? I exist as a thinking thing necessarily. So the cogito, which is the Latin way of expressing Descartes' idea, is indubitable. And this is super significant. Not only because the self becomes a piece of knowledge and an existence that we cannot doubt, but because in Descartes' later meditations, which we didn't cover yet, you'll see how finding out about that foundation of self is the basis upon which he proves the existence of everything else, like God and the world and all that good stuff. So the self not only exists for Descartes, it necessarily exists, and it serves as the foundation for proving everything else that exists. So it's the cornerstone, right? Without the self, he couldn't have gotten where he got. So we see a continuation of this idea of self happen in Locke. First of all, where there's this distinction between subject and object, right? It's the objects that are being encountered by the subject, and the subject's mind is doing some stuff, and then this is how we get our idea of reality, right? Through a combination of objective qualities and subjective qualities that arise from the encounters with those objects, right? And in Locke, he talked about the idea of identity in general, right? There's this idea of sameness, right? Things persist throughout time. This marker is the same as it was now. And my cat today is the same cat as it was 10 years ago. And that tree outside is the same tree as it was 50 years ago. So there's this idea of sameness. And not only that, I am the same. Of course, there's differences. I don't have the same exact feelings that I had, when I was a little kid, but there's a participation in the same conscious life, right? Not just life, but in the content of consciousness. And this is where personal identity arises. And then this subject-orientedness gets solidified even more in Berkeley, who said, you know what? Actually, the mind is the only thing that exists. The subject is so real that only the subject is real, right? This idea of external reality we have is just that. It's just an idea, because all of the things we experience at the end of the day are just bundles of perceptions, right? Bundles of sensory qualities, of ideas, and things only exist when they're being perceived by a subject. So that's what we have so far. And in each of those philosophers, even though you see some fundamental disagreements between Descartes being an innatist and Locke being an empiricist, between Locke and Berkeley having disagreements about the existence of the external world, we see one common feature. And that common feature is this idea that there exists a self. There exists some sameness either in the world or in me or in the combination of those things. But a question we have to ask ourselves now, and this might shake our certainty, is this. can we be wrong about any of this? Can we be wrong about what the self is or what the self does? Or could we even be wrong about the existence of this thing called the self? This is where Hume comes in. Now, in some sense, we could say that Hume is taking empiricism to its radical conclusion in a way that Berkeley did not. So I'm going to read the first paragraph from the Treatise of Human Nature and see where we go from there. So right in the beginning on page 1, Hume says, "There are some philosophers who imagine we are at every moment intimately conscious of what we call our self, that we feel its existence and its continuance in existence, and are certain beyond the evidence of demonstration, both of its perfect identity and its simplicity. The strongest sensation, the most violent passion, say they, instead of distracting us from this view, only fix it the more intensely, and make us consider their influence on self either by their pleasure or pain. To attempt a farther proof of this were to weaken its evidence, since no proof can be derived from any fact of which we are so intimately conscious, nor is there anything of which we can be certain if we doubt this." So a bunch of stuff going on there. What Hume is doing right now is giving us some insight into the common view of the self throughout not only the history of philosophy, but the history of basic human intuition. We all think that we exist. We all use the word I. We all think there's this presence behind our eyes, so to speak, and it's through this presence that we see reality, right? Our self serves as this kind of window through which everything else happens, and even if we can doubt everything else, we can't doubt, right, that core, that little dot behind the window that serves as our vantage point for reality, so to speak. And we're convinced of its identity, right, that it has these fixed qualities that persist throughout time, and we're convinced of its simplicity, meaning we're convinced that it's one thing, right? There is a self, and the self is this one little dot that I am, and even though it undergoes modifications, it still remains the same in the ever-changing nature of reality. But Hume's going to criticize this view. So if we look at the next passage, and then we'll do some stuff on the board, Hume says, "Unluckily, all these positive assertions are contrary to that very experience which is pleaded for them, nor have we any idea of self after the manner it is here explained. For from what impression could this idea be derived? This question 'tis impossible to answer without a manifest contradiction and absurdity, and yet it is a question which must necessarily be answered if we would have the idea of self pass for clear and intelligible. It must be some one impression that gives rise to every real idea. But self or person is not any one impression, but that to which our several impressions and ideas are supposed to have a reference. If any impression gives rise to the idea of self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist in that manner. But there is no impression constant and variable. Pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passions and sensations succeed each other and never all exist at the same time. It cannot, therefore, be from any of these impressions or from any other that the idea of self is derived, and consequently, there is no such idea. So this is where it starts to get very interesting, right? Because Hume is saying that typically we think there is this thing called self. And we're sure of the self's existence because we say, oh, I have this feeling of myself. I have this idea of myself. But he's saying, you actually don't. Now, to understand why this is the case, we have to understand this distinction between impressions and ideas. Now, Hume's distinction between impressions and ideas is basically the same thing as Locke's distinction between sensations and ideas or reflections. So the idea is that an impression is some immediate sensory experience that happens. So for example, if I'm drinking my water, I feel wetness on my lips, right? That's an impression. And if I rub the board, it feels smooth. That's an impression. And then now I can reflect upon those impressions and think about how the water felt on my lips and think about how this felt. And what I'm doing on the inside is representing the impression that happens. So far we see overlap with Locke. Not only in this distinction, but in the sense that Hume is saying ideas necessarily come from impressions, like 99% of the time. There's one exception he makes, but it's kind of shaky and questionable, and even if it's true, we don't need to get into it. But the idea is that sensory experience gives rise to all knowledge and ideas. And this is what ultimately makes a Hume empiricist like Locke and like Berkeley. I combined their names there. But let's kind of think about this. In order for there to be an idea of something, there has to be an impression of something, right? It's only because I've had an experience of what the board feels like that I can imagine what it feels like. It's only that I've had an experience of a mountain and the color gold that I can imagine a gold mountain, right? Even if I've never seen it directly, I've had the fundamental level sensory experiences that allow me to have that idea, right? So this should be the same for everything. So it should be the same for the self. So if there's an idea of self, it must come from some impression. But Hume wants to say, wait a second. You've never had an impression of the self. You've never had some base level sensory experience of the self. And so I invite you guys to think about this for a second. Try to imagine when you had a direct experience in one moment of yourself. Think about it. I'll think about it too. Because you might be thinking, wait, this sounds crazy. I've obviously had impressions of myself. But Hume would say, do you? Because you might say, yeah, okay, I remember when I broke my arm and I remembered how it hurt and I remembered how vivid it was and like that was myself experiencing something. And you say, wait, I remember in this one moment when I fell in love with somebody, like that was such a vivid experience, how could I deny the existence of myself? And Hume says, no. When your arm was broke, you didn't have a sensation of yourself, you had a sensation of pain. You had a sensation of your arm in one moment, and then a different sensation of your arm, and then a different sensation of your arm, and then sadness, and then an emotion, and then emotion, and emotion. There was no self in there. Similarly, when you fell in love with someone, you didn't experience yourself. You experienced a moment of attraction, a moment of love, a moment of bonding, a moment of joy, happiness. Where's the self? Where's the self? And even if you want to include like, oh, I experienced the experience of that thing, because you think, oh, maybe that gives me the self. That's not the self. Because remember, the self is a continued thing throughout time, supposedly. Right? It's this identity you maintain over a period of time. You say, I am the same. But by definition, if sameness is sameness throughout time, you can't actually experience sameness within any given moment. And if you only ever have sensations in a given moment, then you can't have a sensation of sameness and therefore a sensation of self. All you ever actually have, according to Hume, is a succession of perceptions. Right? So if you look at consciousness as this stream, which makes sense, and you break your stream of consciousness into a series of sensations, you say, okay, here maybe I'm hungry, so I go over to, I don't know, like my sandwich, and the sandwich smells good, and then I put the sandwich to my lips, and this sounds weird, and I get some kind of texture, and then I get a specific taste, and then I feel relief, and then I feel joy, And then after the whole experience, I feel happy. Okay. You feel this, then you feel this, then you feel this, blah, 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 all the way down the line, right? Where do you experience the self? Because all I see is a series of perceptions. Here's a perception of hungriness, here's a perception of a scent, here's a perception of a texture, here's a perception of the taste. At what point do you actually experience yourself? And Hume says, you don't. There is no impression of the self. And since there's no impression of the self, there's no actual idea of the self in the way we typically imagine it. So the thing we call self at the end of the day is very different from what we typically consider the self to be. It's actually nothing other than a bundle of perceptions. Oops. And that's all it is. And he has a famous quote on this that appears, I believe, on the second page. Let me see. Yeah, so if you look at, first of all, if you look at the end of page 1, that last paragraph, 4 lines down at the end, Hume says, "For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble upon some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. When my perception, so the idea is whenever you remember something or whenever something's happening, what you're experiencing is a perception. And then you experience another perception. And you can't ever actually stop to be like, oh, there's myself. Because whenever you look for the self, all you actually find is a perception. No matter which perception you look at, the self isn't going to be there. And you say, okay, maybe the self isn't a perception. And he says, okay, well, when my perceptions are removed, as when I'm asleep or dead, well, then there is no self. So the only candidate for the self to exist is within perceptions, and it's not actually in that area of existence. And so at the top of 2, he has this famous line. He says, "But setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind that they, us, are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivably rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. Inconceivable rapidity, sorry. So all we are, and that's even the wrong way of talking about it because there's not a thing that we are. All that's happening is a succession of sensory perceptions. That's all. And this has some pretty dramatic repercussions, at the very least for our everyday intuition, right? So the only time the self happens is in the past. And this is something that a philosopher named Jean-Paul Sartre, I think, picks up on later in the 20th century. But the idea is you think of something happening in the past, and then you think of something else happening in the past, and then you think of something else happening in the past, and then you relate those things in your memory. And then you say, I've discovered myself. But that's interesting, because if that's the case, there's never actually a self in the present. And there's never actually a self in the future, because the future didn't happen yet. So the self is just this abstraction, this non-tangible thing, a relation of ideas that only happens after the fact, when you reflect upon your past. So there's no self in hunger, smells good, taste, eat, joy. There's only self in after the fact, when consciousness is reflecting upon those perceptions. It discovers this relation between them. I don't want to say creates, because Hume is skeptical about that, but there's this kind of false sense of sameness. And here's Hume's critique of Locke, because you remember in Locke, he believed that identity was this idea that something persists throughout time, right? Something is this, and then now it's this, and then now it's this, and there's no change, therefore it is the same, therefore it has an identity, right? The thing is the thing that it is, necessarily. And this applies not just to objects, who whose material constitution remaining the same is what makes the identity, but it also applies to animals whose participation in the same continued life constitutes its identity, same with plants. And then for humans, it's all about that content of consciousness, which makes us who we are, which gives us personal identity, so to speak. But Hume wants to say all that's kind of an illusion. There's really no such thing as sameness. Everything is always changing. And this goes back to, I would say, a pre-Socratic idea by a guy named Heraclitus, who's famous for this fragment that you can never step in the same river twice because new water's constantly rushing in. Didn't come from Pocahontas, came from Heraclitus. But Hume is saying something very similar. He's saying, wait, like moments are happening. You can never stumble upon the same moment. And you can't say that this moment in time is the same as that moment in time, because that's a contradiction, because you're already drawing a distinction. So there's a difference, so there can't be sameness by definition, right? And it's the same thing with objects. It's like, why is this marker now the same that it was last week? For example, haven't I used more of the ink or whatever it is inside of it? So isn't it actually a different marker because it has less stuff in it? He says, we convince ourselves no, right? We say, if a little bit changes at a time, then it's the same thing, right? Okay, this pen has this much ink, and then at the end of the semester it has only this much ink. And we say, but it's the same pen, because over time it slowly changed, and changed slowly enough, it didn't register for us. And your hair grows slowly, and your fingernails grow slowly, and you say, I'm the same person, right? But he says, that's kind of a trick. That's a trick of consciousness, right? The idea is actually change is always happening, and we just kind of, this may be a loaded term, but project might be a good way of explaining it, this idea of sameness, of order, onto a reality which actually doesn't contain order. Because time is changing, because the cells on things are moving, we could say now, because the material properties are changing, because even the content of my consciousness is changing. There never actually is sameness. And this may sound freaky, or it may sound something like we want to be skeptical of, but I mean, see if he's wrong. See if you can ever imagine sameness. First of all, see if you can ever point to yourself in one moment, in one perception. You can't. Which means there's no real idea of the self. And it's just this kind of artificial bundle of perceptions. And I mean, even think of everyday objects, right? Because you may say, oh, this is the same pen, because even though there's less ink in it, it's the same pen. But why are we considering the pen everything but the ink? Couldn't we consider the pen's identity everything, including the ink? And in which case it'd be a different pen. So the mind makes all these arbitrary distinctions. And it's these arbitrary distinctions that allow us to have this illusion of sameness, of identity, of personal identity, of self in reality, but that's actually not the case. So I will leave us there. I know that's a lot to take in. As always, if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me. Feel free to look this stuff up on YouTube and Google, as I always say, because these guys are going to be your best friends. And I don't know. Good luck. Have a good day, guys. I'll see you around.